For this project, I'll be building a kitchen set out of one of these Teak project panel boards. These boards are about $60 at Lowe's and come pre-cut in a 2x2 foot square. These will be end grain pieces, so I poked around to find a board with a unique end grain pattern. Then I took a walk to the hardware aisle to pick out a set of handles for the charcuterie board. I like the look of these ones. They're not too decorative and they'll definitely help the darker grains pop. With everything bought, I measured a center line to rip the board in the direction of the glued up panels. I also upgraded my saw blade for cleaner cuts. With the board ripped in half, it was now time to cut out the 1-inch strips. I used a square scrap piece of wood to serve as a stop to help speed up the process. I cut 18 1-inch strips out of each board and numbered the ends as I cut them. Numbering them would help with the grain orientation when laying out the patterns. All the strips were cut, so now it was time to bring them inside for the glue up. I then laid out all the strips in the correct order to start brainstorming an idea for the grain pattern. I chose an end grain layout in order to have a tougher and more durable surface. I decided on having the grains mirrored and repeated to give the boards a cool repeated book matched look. While some people might not like the knots and imperfections in the grain, I love it, and I think it adds character to the wood. With the pattern figured out, I got the first board ready for the glue up. I'll be using TiteBond 3 for the glue since it's food safe. I kind of struggled at first finding a good way to glue them up and to keep all the patterns lined up and surfaces even. Let me know in the comments if you have any ideas or advice for clamp placements that would help with this. Before tightening down all the clamps in the last shot, I spread some fine teak sawdust to help better hide the glue up joints. After 24 hours, it was time to see how the first board glued up. While the patterns lined up nicely, the board had unfortunately buckled slightly under the clamp pressure, so there was a slight bow to the board. Yeah, it's got a little bend to it. I'm not too worried though. I should be able to even out the surfaces with the router. Here I'm applying some double-sided tape to secure the board to the workbench surface and keep it from moving around. Off camera, I built this rough router jig that would allow me to clean up the surface. I started with working the router along the edges and worked my way towards the center of the piece to avoid any tear-outs along the edges of the board. Normally I would have just run this through the planer and removed tiny amounts at a time, but I really didn't want to risk tearing out the ends of the board. Don't get me wrong, you definitely can still do this with the planer. I just didn't want to risk accidentally taking too much material off and damaging the board. While not the best router jig out there, the surface actually came out nice and flush. I then flipped the board over and repeated this process for the other side. The surfaces were now flush, so it was time to start sanding. I started with 80 grit to remove any imperfections or leftover glue. While sanding, I actually thought of a cool idea for some of the leftover scrap teak. I had 2 leftover pieces that were a good size to make utensils out of, so I grabbed some old wooden utensils to trace an outline. If you're wondering why the boards are different widths, it's because I messed up and I wasn't square on the first cut of the second board when cutting out the 1-inch strips. Not bad. Time to cut them out. I'll be sanding them down, so I don't need my cuts to be right on the line. And I forgot to charge the battery beforehand.
Come on.
There we go.
Oh, gotta charge that one.
I'll have to wait for the battery to charge before I cut out the spatula shape. In the meantime, I'll square off all the edges of the cutting board. My blade depth was a touch high, so I ended up just using the spatula to take off the excess. With the edges cleaned and squared up, it's time to route out the juice trap. Fortunately, this router came with a really nice and sturdy edge guide. Like before, I used some double-sided tape to hold the board in place, and then started cutting out the juice trap. I removed little by little with each pass, and the cuts turned out great. There was no burring or burn marks or any of that. Upgrading to a corded router was definitely a good move. Yeah, the cord might be inconvenient, but I love not having to worry about RPM fall off as the battery becomes depleted. After, I rounded over all the edges, and now that the battery was charged, I could finish cutting out the spatula shape. Time to clean these guys up on the belt and disc sander. I used the disc sander to clean up the outlines of the utensils, and then the belt sander for rounding out the shape of the spatula and serving spoon. Not bad for a first time doing something like this. They actually turned out pretty well. At this point, I'm about halfway done with the project. I still need to glue up the charcuterie board and sand out the final shape of the serving spoon. I decided to tackle the charcuterie board next. I wasn't a fan of the bow on the last glue up, so I tried a different clamp layout for this one. This time I used some 10-pound weights to help weigh the pieces down as they dried. 24 hours had passed and it was time to check on the glue up. This glue up came out a lot more even. I used my router jig again to clean up the surfaces of each side, and then sanded both sides with 80 grit paper. I started to lay out the handle placement and wasn't really a huge fan of the size of the board. It felt way too big. So I had to decide what side of the board I was going to remove. I decided to remove the darker side of the board. The opposite side had a better pattern in my opinion, as well as some knots that blended the grain pattern together. After I cleaned and squared up all the sides by removing a 1/4 inch from each edge. Rookie mistake, but I totally thought I was recording when I did this. Essentially what I did was I measured and centered each of the handles and then used a countersink bit to drill out the holes for the handle screws. And time to test the fit. Not bad. I'm glad I cut down on the board size. The board felt too large before. Like the cutting board, I ended up using the router to round off all the edges of the charcuterie board. And then I moved on to the serving spoon. Now, I'm sure I'm going to be getting some comments on this, but I didn't have any carving chisels to remove the opening of the serving spoon. So I pretty much resorted to a combination of sanders and hand sanding out the opening. If you're looking for a good arm workout, I highly recommend. Otherwise, do what I should have done and order some carving chisels. After sanding the spoon for over 30 minutes, I wanted nothing to do with it and switched gears back to the boards. After wiping the surfaces with a tack cloth, I sprayed a light coat of water to help pop the grain before I sand the surfaces smooth. Water popping these boards gave me a nice sneak peek at what the finished grain would look like after oil and wax are applied. My favorite part would have to be the way the grain pattern rolls over the juice trap on the cutting board. So I patiently waited for the boards to dry and sanded the surfaces at 400 grit. Once the boards were sanded, I brought everything out into the garage to use the branding iron. The temperature was in the single digits, so I tried doing this quickly without rushing for the sake of the wood. I brought the boards back inside and then came back out to round out the bottom of the serving spoon on the belt sander. With the utensils shaped, I can now water pop the grain and hand sand them smooth. For the juice trap on the cutting board, I ended up rolling 400 grit paper around a glue stick, and this worked out great. The shape of the glue stick was perfect for this. With everything sanded, it was time to apply the oil. I'm using Howard food grade mineral oil for this, and I applied it with a rag on all the pieces. The grain detail after the oil looks awesome. Time to let this cure for an hour. I ended up using some scrap teak to raise the pieces off the mat for the curing period. A little over an hour later, and it was time to apply the conditioner. This is Howard Butcher Block Conditioner, and it has some natural waxes infused to help protect the wood from wear over time. I let the wax sit for over an hour and then wiped off the excess with a paper towel. Now that the boards were cured, I can install the handles on the charcuterie board. And just like that, the kitchen set was all done. I love the final result of these pieces, and for under $100 at Lowe's on material, I highly recommend this project for beginners. I'm a huge fan of the repeated book match grain pattern, and I think it gives the piece a very unique look. I also like the brushed bronze accents on the handles. I think it matches very well with the darker warm grain colors of the teak. The only thing I probably would have done differently was the orientation of the boards and the utensils. I'm not sure what the company used to glue the boards together, so I'm not sure how strong these joints will be over time. Having the grain run vertically and gluing the boards up myself would probably have been a better option. While I do think they look really nice, I'm not entirely sure how well the joints on the handles are going to hold up, especially if you're stirring something thick like chili or sauce. Thank you all for watching. A full list of tools used will be in the description of this video. Please let me know in the comments if you have any advice on woodworking tips or if you just have some cool ideas for my next project. Thank you.